Mixed martial arts is still in its early stages compared to other sports such as basketball and soccer, but it is clearly on the rise, both in participation and spectators. Melbourne has seen the same type of growth with the sport, as mixed martial arts has seen a tremendous rise in the past 10 years in Melbourne. Melbourne-based amateur fighter Liam Gusty was able to give some insight on his own personal experiences, both with participating and watching the sport grow.
Yeah, so I actually made my debut when I was 16, so the same year I started training, which was a bit early, but because of that, I got to see the scene a few years earlier than now. So now I'm 21, and yeah, the scene from back then, my first fight was in like a little pub. The crowd wasn't too big, but they had like the cage and the setup, and it was obviously a start. Now, 5 years later, after that, the crowd's much bigger, and even now the amateurs fight in the same venue as the professional fighters. So I fight on a show called Part the Hex, and the Hex show is held at the Melbourne Pavilion, and now the amateur fighters fight on the same show.
Gusty's experience of growing in the amateur scene highlight the importance of amateur MMA, as it helps pave the way for the professional scene to flourish. This view is backed by Gusty's coach, Nikos Trepka, an MMA coach and fighter who has seen the growth of the sport firsthand.
So, in 2014, I turned professional in mixed martial arts, and at the time there was no cage allowance. So the cage allowance came in Melbourne in 2015. So before that, all the MMA fights used to happen in the ring, and there was a big mess of organizations and stuff. So the amateur, the beginner scene, there was 0 to none, like minimum to none. So that meant that there was not structure for amateur fighters to get started. So like myself and a lot of fighters at the time that wanted to build a career, we didn't really get a chance to have amateur fights. So we were thrown straight into pro after 1 or 2, let's say. That led us to some of us having broken records, some people lost the drive, And so the difference over the years, using example myself, is when the cage allowance and the cage was allowed in Victoria, since after 2015, a lot of amateur shows started happening inside the cage. So you see all the gyms, there is a league of amateur fighting now. So a lot of beginners, novice, interclub, and then you're fighting into the amateur shows, and that's how there is a bit of evolution in the discipline and the skills and even the numbers in Victoria.
A healthy amateur scene has helped the Melbourne MMA scene grow, but there are still more ways for the sport to expand in the state.
So to push along the growth of MMA in Melbourne, honestly, would be to get fighters from all over the world to come here to compete. And it might be a bit bold to say this, but maybe less Melburnians fighting Melburnians, maybe more people from Melbourne, or even people from Australia fighting people from New Zealand, fighting people from different countries, because sometimes if you're only fighting each other, you're limiting your growth, because it's only your little team without maybe all of Melbourne working together to beat somewhere else. So,
with a sport that is ready to flourish in the mainstream, Hex General Manager Jacob Watts sees even more growth for the sport in the coming years.
I think that MMA in Melbourne and Hex are both going to keep growing at a rapid rate. With the exposure that the UFC is getting on the mainstream media now, with stars in Australia and New Zealand like Jimmy Crute, Rob Whittaker, Alex Volkanovski, Israel Adesanya, I think it's only going to continue to grow, and the more and more successful guys that come out of the shows like Hex, the bigger MMA is going to become in Melbourne.
A sport that has taken such significant steps for so early in its story, Melbourne MMA is going to keep breaking barriers and reaching new heights.